My name is Jessica Morgan. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent the last 8 years working as a certified gemologist, traveling between auction houses in New York, private collectors in Los Angeles, and estate sales across the Pacific Northwest. When I walked into that conference room at Wells & Associates last Tuesday morning, my father was already pouring champagne into crystal flutes. My sister Amanda was laughing so hard she had tears streaming down her cheeks. The lawyer, Patricia Wells, sat behind a stack of documents looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To Grandma Helen's sense of humor, my father announced, raising his glass toward the rain-streaked windows overlooking downtown Portland. Leaving Jessica the old cabin and some dusty jewelry boxes. I guess she figured you'd appreciate the sentimental value since you never cared about real money anyway. Amanda clinked her glass against his, both of them grinning like they'd just won the lottery. Which, in a way, they had. The house, the investment accounts, the rental properties, Helen's art collection, it all went to them. I got a rundown hunting cabin near Mount Hood that hadn't had running water since the Clinton administration, and what the will described as personal effects and jewelry collection housed therein. I sat there listening to them celebrate my inheritance of what they clearly considered worthless junk, and I smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when someone tells a funny joke, the kind you give when you know something they don't, and you're about to let them find out the hard way. Growing up in the Morgan family meant growing up around jewelry. Not wearing it, necessarily, but understanding it. My great-grandfather started Morgan's Fine Jewelry in downtown Portland back in 1943, right after he came home from the Pacific Theater. Grandma Helen met him when she was 19, fresh out of secretarial school, and fell in love with both him and the glittering world he inhabited. By the time I was old enough to walk, I was spending every weekend at the shop, watching Helen sort through estate purchases with a jeweler's loupe pressed to her eye like a monocle. She taught me to spot the difference between genuine Art Deco platinum and cheap reproductions, how to identify the telltale inclusions that marked a natural diamond versus a synthetic one, and most importantly, how to recognize when someone was trying to pass off costume jewelry as the real thing. Helen had an eye for authenticity that bordered on supernatural. She could glance at a pearl necklace from across a crowded estate sale and tell you whether it came from cultured Akoya oysters or a factory in China. My father Bob never understood the craft. To him, jewelry was just another commodity to be bought low and sold high. When great-grandpa passed in 1987 and left the business to Helen, Bob spent every family dinner for the next 20 years suggesting she sell the shop and invest in something practical. He'd earned his MBA from Portland State and worked his way up to regional manager at a mid-sized accounting firm, which apparently qualified him to lecture a woman who'd been successfully running a jewelry business since before he was born. Amanda inherited his business sense, but none of Helen's artistic appreciation. She married a real estate developer named Kevin Sullivan when she was 26, moved to a McMansion in Lake Oswego, and started referring to Helen's shop as, quote, that little trinket store. She'd bring her friends by during the holidays, pointing out pieces in the display cases with barely concealed condescension. Oh, that's grandmother's vintage stuff, she'd say, like vintage was synonymous with outdated. I was different. Maybe it was because I spent so much time with Helen, or maybe I just inherited whatever gene makes someone capable of sitting still for hours examining tiny facets under magnification. But I loved everything about gemology, the precision of it, the way a stone's history could be read in its inclusions like tree rings, the fact that every genuine piece told a story about the person who'd chosen it, worn it, treasured it enough to pass it down. When I graduated from high school, my father made it clear that he expected me to choose a sensible major. Business administration, maybe accounting like him, or at least something that would lead to a stable corporate job with benefits and a retirement plan. When I told him I wanted to study gemology and eventually take over Helen's shop, he looked at me like I'd announced my intention to become a professional fortune teller. Jessica, that shop barely breaks even, he said, gesturing with his coffee mug toward the kitchen window as if he could see the downtown jewelry district from our house in Hillcrest. Helen's been subsidizing it with inheritance money for decades. It's not a business, it's an expensive hobby. But Helen supported my decision. She helped me apply to the Gemological Institute of America, co-signed my student loans when my parents refused, and promised that when I graduated, there would be a place for me at Morgan's Fine Jewelry. She even started teaching me about her private collection, the pieces she kept separate from the shop's inventory. Every few months, she'd invite me up to the old cabin near government camp, where she stored what she called her special acquisitions. The cabin had belonged to her first husband, Helen's son from her brief first marriage, who died in Vietnam. She'd inherited it in 1969 and used it as a weekend retreat, but more importantly, as a secure location where she could examine and catalog high-value pieces away from the scrutiny of insurance adjusters and tax assessors. She showed me how she'd converted the back bedroom into a proper workshop, complete with professional lighting and a ventilation system for handling cleaning chemicals. But she never showed me everything. There were always locked drawers in her workbench, sealed containers she'd redirect my attention away from when I got too curious. "Some collections require special care," she'd say mysteriously. "When you're ready, you'll understand." I graduated from GIA in 2018, with certifications in diamond grading and colored stone identification. I'd planned to come home and start working at the shop immediately, but Helen encouraged me to get some experience with high-end auction houses first. "Learn how the serious collectors think," she advised. "Understand the difference between retail customers and people who view jewelry as investment art." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So I spent 4 years working for Sotheby's, Christie's, and several private auction houses, developing expertise in estate jewelry authentication. I learned to spot the subtle differences between pieces from major houses like Cartier and Tiffany versus high-quality imitations. I worked with insurance companies to verify claims on stolen or damaged pieces. I even testified as an expert witness in a few fraud cases involving fake vintage jewelry being passed off as authentic estate pieces. But every few months, I'd drive back to Portland to spend weekends with Helen at the cabin. She'd always have new pieces to show me, acquisitions she'd made through private dealers or estate settlements that had somehow bypassed the normal auction channels. She taught me about provenance research, how to trace a piece's ownership history through old insurance records and family photographs. She showed me how to identify unmarked pieces by their construction techniques and stylistic details. Most importantly, she taught me to trust my instincts. "Paper certificates can be forged," she'd say, holding a sapphire bracelet up to the natural light streaming through the cabin's pine-framed windows. "But the stone doesn't lie. Learn to listen to what it tells you." The last time I saw Helen was 3 months before she passed. I'd driven up from Los Angeles, where I was working on authenticating a collection of supposed Edwardian jewelry for a private collector. She seemed more fragile than usual, moving carefully around the cabin like her bones were made of glass. But her eyes were as sharp as ever when she examined the photographs I'd brought of the pieces I was working on. "Half of these are reproductions," she said after barely glancing at them. "Good ones, but the platinum alloy is wrong for the period. See how the prong settings are too uniform?" Hand-fabricated pieces from that era would show more variation. She was right, of course. The collector had been trying to pass off 1970s reproductions as genuine Edwardian pieces worth 10 times their actual value. That weekend, Helen seemed more interested than usual in showing me around the cabin. She walked me through the basement, pointing out the foundation work her first husband had done to reinforce the structure. She showed me the mechanical systems, how to operate the generator during winter power outages, where the water shutoff valve was located. At the time, I assumed she was just being practical, making sure I'd be able to maintain the place after she was gone. On Sunday morning, as I was loading my car to drive back to the city, she handed me a small brass key on a leather cord. "This opens a safety deposit box at First National downtown," she said. "Branch manager's name is Patricia Chen. Tell her you're Helen's granddaughter, and she'll take care of you." I started to ask what was in the box, but Helen just smiled and shook her head. "Insurance policy," she said cryptically. "Some things are too valuable to leave to chance." Helen passed away 6 weeks later. Heart attack in her sleep, according to the coroner. She was found by her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd come over to check on her when Helen didn't show up for their usual Tuesday morning coffee at Blue Moon Cafe. The funeral was small, just immediate family and a few longtime customers from the shop. My father handled most of the arrangements, and I noticed he made a point of scheduling the service during the week, when most of Helen's friends from the jewelry community wouldn't be able to attend. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I drove up from San Francisco, where I'd been working on a particularly complex authentication project involving what claimed to be Marie Antoinette's personal jewelry collection. I'd been looking forward to finally having time to properly grieve Helen's loss and to start making plans for taking over the shop. I should have known something was wrong when I arrived at the law office and found my father and Amanda already celebrating. They were dressed in expensive black outfits that managed to look both appropriately funeral serious and subtly triumphant. Amanda kept checking her phone and whispering to my father about property assessments and, quote, development potential. Patricia Wells, the lawyer, greeted me with the kind of professional sympathy that lawyers perfect for situations like this. She led us into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. The October morning was gray and drizzly, typical for Portland, and the sound of rain against the glass created an appropriately somber soundtrack. Helen's will was surprisingly straightforward. The house in Hillcrest, her investment portfolio, and her art collection went to my father as her eldest child. The jewelry shop and its current inventory went to Amanda, along with Helen's personal jewelry, and a cash bequest of $50,000. I got the cabin and all personal effects collections and items housed therein. Patricia Wells read the relevant section aloud in her careful legal voice. To my granddaughter Jessica Morgan, who alone among my family shares my appreciation for the true value of beautiful things, I leave my cabin property near Government Camp, Oregon, including all structures, outbuildings, and contents. I trust she will understand the full significance of this bequest and will honor the care I have taken in assembling what she will find there. My father and Amanda exchanged glances and started giggling like teenagers. A cabin with no plumbing and some dusty jewelry boxes, Amanda whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. I guess Helen really did have a sense of humor after all. But I caught something in Patricia Wells' expression as she read that section. A slight tightening around her eyes, like she knew something the rest of us didn't. When my father started making jokes about me inheriting Helen's junk collection, Patricia Wells cleared her throat pointedly. I should mention, she said carefully, that Helen specifically requested that Jessica visit the property alone before making any decisions about its contents. She was quite emphatic about this point. My father waved dismissively. I'm sure Jessica will want help cleaning the place out. That cabin's been sitting empty for months. Probably mice, water damage. Who knows what kind of condition Helen's old things are in. Nevertheless, Patricia Wells continued, Helen's instructions were very clear. Jessica is to have unrestricted access to the property and its contents for a period of 30 days, before any other family members are permitted on the premises. I looked up from the will documents, suddenly paying closer attention. Helen had always been sentimental, but she'd never been one for dramatic gestures or mysterious instructions. The fact that she'd specifically built legal protections around my access to the cabin suggested she'd been planning something. After the will reading ended, my father and Amanda headed straight to the house in Hillcrest to start cataloging Helen's art collection. They invited me to join them for lunch, an invitation that felt more like an afterthought than genuine family bonding. I declined, claiming I needed to drive up to the cabin to assess the property condition. Don't spend too much time up there, Amanda advised as we stood in the lobby of the law office. Kevin knows a guy who specializes in mountain property cleanup. Probably cost more to restore that old place than it's worth, but at least you could sell the land. I nodded non-committally and walked out into the Portland drizzle. My rental car was parked on the street, and as I unlocked it, I noticed Patricia Wells standing under the building's awning, smoking a cigarette. She caught my eye and walked over. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, she said without preamble. I handled her legal affairs for the past 15 years, and I can tell you she was very deliberate about every decision she made. I waited for her to continue, sensing there was more she wanted to say. The cabin bequest, Patricia Wells continued, flicking ash into the gutter. Helen was very specific about the wording. She wanted to make sure you understood that everything housed on the property belongs to you. Everything. Not just furniture and personal items, but anything she may have stored there over the years. Something in her tone made me pay closer attention. Did she tell you what I might find there? Patricia Wells smiled slightly. Helen was always discreet about her business affairs. But I will say this. She spent considerable time and resources ensuring that property was properly secured and climate controlled. That's unusual for what most people would consider a simple vacation cabin. She dropped her cigarette and ground it under her heel. Drive carefully up the mountain, she said. And Jessica? Take your time exploring. Helen clearly believed you'd appreciate whatever she left for you. I drove through downtown Portland in a daze, Patricia Wells' words echoing in my head. The rain had intensified, and the windshield wipers of my rental car struggled to keep up with the sheets of water cascading down from the gray October sky. Traffic moved slowly along the wet streets, giving me time to process what had just happened. My father and Amanda had inherited nearly everything of obvious value from Helen's estate, while I'd been left with what they clearly considered the equivalent of a consolation prize. But something about Patricia Wells's manner suggested there was more to Helen's final gift than met the eye. The lawyer's emphasis on the phrase "everything housed therein" felt deliberate, almost like she was trying to communicate something without directly violating attorney-client privilege. And Helen's specific instruction that I should explore the cabin alone for 30 days before allowing other family members access seemed uncharacteristically controlling for a woman who'd always encouraged me to make my own decisions. I pulled into a parking space outside Blue Moon Cafe, the same place where Helen had met Mrs. Patterson for coffee every Tuesday morning for the past decade. The cafe was nearly empty, just a few laptop-wielding freelancers occupying the mismatched furniture that gave the place its bohemian charm. I ordered a double espresso and sat by the window, watching pedestrians hurry past under umbrellas and rain jackets. The brass key Helen had given me 3 months earlier was still in my purse, wrapped in the same leather cord she'd tied around it. I'd completely forgotten about the safety deposit box at First National Bank in all the chaos surrounding her death and the funeral arrangements. Now it seemed like the logical first step before driving up to the mountain cabin. First National's downtown branch occupied the ground floor of a historic building that had somehow survived Portland's various waves of urban renewal. The lobby retained its original 1920s marble floors and brass fixtures, giving it an air of old-world financial solidity. I approached the customer service desk and asked to speak with Patricia Chen, the branch manager Helen had mentioned. Patricia Chen turned out to be a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When I introduced myself as Helen Morgan's granddaughter, her entire demeanor shifted from professional courtesy to genuine warmth. "I've been expecting you," she said, leading me toward a private office behind the main banking floor. "Your grandmother spoke about you often. She was very proud of your work in gemology." This surprised me. Helen had always been supportive of my career, but I hadn't realized she'd discussed it with her banker. Patricia Chen noticed my confusion and smiled. "Helen consulted with me regularly about security arrangements for high-value items," she explained. "She mentioned that you were one of the few people in her family who truly understood the jewelry business." She led me down a narrow staircase to the bank's vault level, where safety deposit boxes lined the walls in neat rows. Helen's box was larger than I'd expected, roughly the size of a small filing cabinet drawer. Patricia Chen used her master key while I inserted Helen's brass key, and the box slid open with a satisfying mechanical click. Inside was a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax, along with a smaller velvet pouch that clinked softly when I lifted it. Patricia Chen directed me to a private viewing room, where I could examine the contents without interruption. The envelope was addressed to me in Helen's careful handwriting, with instructions written below my name in her distinctive purple ink. "Open only after visiting the cabin workshop," the instructions read. "Trust the process, trust your training, trust what your eyes tell you." I set the envelope aside and opened the velvet pouch. Inside were 5 loose diamonds, each about 2 carats, all perfectly cut and absolutely flawless to my naked eye. Even under the viewing room's standard fluorescent lighting, they threw off fire and brilliance that made my breath catch. These weren't the kind of stones you'd find in typical estate jewelry. These were investment-grade gems, the kind that auction houses reserved for their most exclusive sales. I borrowed a jeweler's loupe from Patricia Chen and examined each stone carefully. The proportions were mathematically perfect, suggesting they'd been cut by a master craftsman. More importantly, each diamond had been laser inscribed with a tiny serial number along the girdle, visible only under magnification. These weren't just valuable stones, they were certified, traceable, and absolutely legitimate. But what struck me most was that the serial numbers followed the pattern I'd learned to recognize during my work with high-end auction houses. These diamonds had been graded and certified by the Gemological Institute of America within the past 5 years. Helen had been acquiring serious investment stones well into her 80s, long after most people would have simplified their affairs. I carefully returned the diamonds to their velvet pouch and secured both it and the sealed envelope in my purse. Patricia Chen walked me back to the main banking floor, where I closed out Helen's safety deposit box account and transferred the contents to my own name. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," Patricia Chen said as she processed the paperwork. She had an excellent eye for quality investments. The drive from downtown Portland to the Mount Hood area took just over an hour, winding through increasingly dense forest as the elevation climbed. Helen's cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off from Highway 26, hidden among towering Douglas firs that provided natural privacy. I'd visited the place dozens of times over the years, but seeing it now as its sole owner felt different somehow. The cabin itself was exactly as I remembered it. Built in the 1940s from local pine logs, it had the rustic charm that came from genuine craftsmanship rather than manufactured nostalgia. Helen had maintained it meticulously over the decades, updating the electrical system and adding modern insulation while preserving its original character. A stone chimney rose from the center of the structure, and a covered porch wrapped around 3 sides of the building. I parked beside Helen's old Subaru Outback, which sat under a carport attached to the cabin's east side. The keys were exactly where she'd always kept them, hanging on a hook just inside the front door. The interior smelled like pine polish, and the lavender sachets Helen had scattered throughout the rooms to discourage moths and mice. The main living area was open and comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and large windows that looked out into the forest. Helen's workshop occupied what had originally been designed as a master bedroom, accessible through a heavy wooden door that she'd fitted with 2 deadbolt locks. I used the keys from the hook by the front door to open both locks and stepped into Helen's private domain. The workshop was a gemologist's dream. Professional lighting systems provided both daylight-balanced illumination and specialized UV lamps for fluorescence testing. A high-end microscope sat on a sturdy workbench, surrounded by precision tools for examining and measuring stones. Temperature and humidity controls maintained optimal conditions for storing delicate pieces, and a sophisticated alarm system protected the entire space. But what immediately caught my attention was how organized everything was. Helen had always been meticulous, but the workshop was arranged with the kind of systematic precision that suggested serious ongoing work rather than casual hobby collecting. Dozens of small storage containers lined one wall, each labeled with dates and acquisition details in Helen's neat handwriting. I spent the next hour exploring the workshop, gradually understanding the scope of Helen's private collecting activities. The labeled containers held everything from Victorian mourning jewelry to Art Nouveau brooches to contemporary designer pieces. Each item was carefully documented, with purchase records, authentication certificates, and detailed condition notes stored in corresponding files. But the most intriguing discovery was a locked filing cabinet, tucked into one corner of the workshop. None of the keys on Helen's ring opened it, and there was no obvious place where she might have hidden an additional key. The cabinet was heavy-duty steel, the kind used for securing important documents or valuable items. I made a mental note to search the rest of the cabin for the key. As afternoon faded into evening, I built a fire in the main fireplace and prepared to spend the night at the cabin. Helen had always kept the place stocked with basic supplies, and I found everything I needed in the kitchen cabinets and linen closet. Sitting by the fire with a cup of tea, I finally opened the envelope from the safety deposit box. Helen's letter was written on her personal stationery, the cream-colored paper she'd used for correspondence throughout my childhood. Her handwriting was shaky but clear, suggesting she'd written it during her final months, when arthritis was making everyday tasks increasingly difficult. "My dearest Jessica," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I've passed on and you've inherited the cabin as I intended. By now, you've discovered my workshop and realized that my collecting activities were more extensive than our family understood. What you haven't yet discovered is the full extent of what I've been preserving for you." The letter went on to explain that Helen had spent the past 20 years quietly acquiring exceptional pieces through private dealers, estate settlements, and occasionally through sources that preferred to remain anonymous. She'd focused on items with impeccable provenance but questionable legal status, pieces that had been stolen during World War II or removed from countries during political upheavals. "I've been what you might call a rescue operation," Helen wrote. "Beautiful things that would otherwise disappear into private collections or be melted down for their material value. I've given them safe harbor while researching their proper ownership and waiting for opportunities to return them to their rightful homes or appropriate museums." This revelation reframed everything I thought I knew about Helen's collecting habits. She hadn't been hoarding valuable jewelry for personal enjoyment or financial gain. She'd been operating as a kind of one-woman cultural preservation society, protecting displaced artworks and artifacts until they could be properly repatriated. The letter concluded with specific instructions for accessing what Helen called her, quote, primary collection. Behind the stone fireplace in the workshop, accessible through a mechanism hidden in the hearth itself, was a climate-controlled vault where she'd stored the most significant pieces. The letter included detailed directions for opening the vault, along with strict warnings about maintaining security and discretion. "Trust your professional judgment," Helen's letter advised. "Some of these pieces are worth more than our family's entire estate combined. Others are priceless for historical reasons that have nothing to do with their material value. You're the only person I trust to handle this responsibility appropriately." I folded the letter carefully and sat staring into the fire, trying to process the implications of what Helen had revealed. The diamonds in the velvet pouch suddenly made sense as examples of what might be waiting in the hidden vault. Helen hadn't just been collecting pretty jewelry. She'd been curating a museum-quality collection of historical artifacts. The next morning, I returned to the workshop with Helen's letter and began following her instructions for accessing the vault. The mechanism was ingeniously hidden within the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the room. By pressing a specific sequence of stones in the hearth's surround, I activated a motorized system that rotated a section of the fireplace wall inward, revealing a steel door set into the cabin's foundation. The vault beyond was larger than I'd expected, roughly the size of a walk-in closet, with walls lined with climate-controlled display cases and storage drawers. Professional lighting illuminated the space, and a dehumidification system hummed quietly in the background. This wasn't some makeshift hiding place. This was a serious conservation facility that had cost Helen considerable money to construct and maintain. The collection inside took my breath away. Display cases held pieces that belonged in major museums rather than a private cabin in the Oregon mountains. I recognized the distinctive style of several famous jewelry houses, including pieces that looked like they might have come from the workshops of Cartier, Fabergé, and Tiffany during their golden ages. One case contained what appeared to be a complete parure of Victorian diamond jewelry, including a tiara that threw rainbows across the vault walls when I moved the lighting. Another held a collection of Art Deco pieces, featuring colored gemstones and platinum settings that represented the pinnacle of 1920s craftsmanship. A third case displayed what looked like ancient jewelry, pieces that might have originated in Egypt or Rome and somehow survived through millennia of political upheaval. But the most stunning discovery was a collection of loose stones stored in individual containers within a series of drawers built into one wall of the vault. These weren't just valuable gems, they were legendary stones, the kind that gemologists read about in textbooks but rarely see in person. I identified what appeared to be several historically significant diamonds, including stones that matched descriptions of gems that had been missing from major collections for decades. Each piece in the vault was meticulously documented. Helen had maintained detailed provenance records, tracking each item's history as far back as she could research. Many of the pieces had been acquired from families fleeing various political crises, sold discreetly to avoid attention from governments or criminal organizations. Others had been recovered from estate sales where their true significance hadn't been recognized by heirs or auction house experts. The scope of Helen's collecting became clear as I spent hours examining the vault's contents. This wasn't random acquisition. This was systematic cultural preservation. Helen had identified items of historical importance that were at risk of being lost, destroyed, or falling into the hands of people who wouldn't appreciate their significance. She'd created a safe haven where these treasures could be properly preserved, while their ultimate destinies were determined. I found myself thinking about the 5 diamonds from the safety deposit box, which now seemed like a small sample of what Helen had been protecting. Those stones alone were worth several $100,000, but they paled in comparison to some of the pieces displayed in the vault. The Victorian tiara, if authentic, was worth more than most people's houses. The ancient jewelry could be priceless from an archaeological perspective, regardless of its material value. But as I continued exploring the vault, I began to understand why Helen had been so secretive about her collecting activities. Many of these pieces existed in legal gray areas. They'd been acquired legitimately from their immediate previous owners. But their ultimate provenance often involved wartime displacement or political upheaval that complicated questions of rightful ownership. Helen had been operating as an informal curator, protecting items that might otherwise have been lost while waiting for appropriate opportunities to ensure their proper placement. Some pieces had documentation indicating Helen's intention to donate them to specific museums when circumstances permitted. Others were marked for repatriation to families or institutions that had lost them during various historical crises. The responsibility of inheriting this collection was overwhelming. Helen had trusted me with items worth millions of dollars, along with the complex ethical questions surrounding their proper disposition. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a mission that would require careful planning and considerable expertise to execute properly. As I locked the vault and returned to the main cabin, I realized that my father and Amanda's celebration at the will reading had been premature. They'd inherited the obvious assets from Helen's estate, but I'd inherited something far more significant. The question now was what to do with Helen's trust, and how to honor her vision while protecting both the collection and myself from the legal and practical complications that might arise. The cabin felt different now that I understood its true purpose. This wasn't just Helen's weekend retreat. It was the headquarters of a sophisticated cultural preservation operation that she'd been running quietly for decades. The workshop wasn't just a hobby space. It was a professional laboratory where Helen had authenticated and documented some of the most significant jewelry pieces to surface in the Pacific Northwest over the past 20 years. I spent that evening going through Helen's files, trying to understand the full scope of what she'd accomplished and what she'd expected me to continue. Her records were meticulous, including correspondence with museums, insurance companies, and law enforcement agencies around the world. Helen had been working with legitimate institutions to resolve ownership questions and facilitate proper placement of items when possible. But she'd also been careful to avoid attracting attention from less legitimate parties who might be interested in acquiring valuable items through less ethical means. The cabin's security system was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized, and Helen's correspondence included references to maintaining discretion about the collection's existence and location. The weight of this responsibility was daunting, but it was also exhilarating. Helen had entrusted me with a collection that represented decades of careful curation and cultural preservation. She'd seen in me not just a trained gemologist, but someone who shared her values about protecting beautiful and historically significant objects for future generations. As I prepared for bed in Helen's cabin, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the mountain forest, I began to understand why she'd structured her will the way she had. My father and Amanda had inherited assets they could easily understand and liquidate. I'd inherited a legacy that would require dedication, expertise, and careful judgment to properly steward. The diamonds in the velvet pouch seemed almost mundane now compared to what waited in the vault, but they represented Helen's confidence in my ability to understand and appreciate what she'd been protecting. Tomorrow, I would need to start making decisions about how to honor her trust, while ensuring the collection's continued safety and eventual proper placement. But tonight I simply sat by the fireplace and marveled at the magnitude of what Helen had accomplished in secret, and at the trust she'd placed in me to continue her work. The cabin that my family had dismissed as worthless was actually the repository for one of the most significant private collections of historical jewelry on the West Coast. Helen's final gift wasn't just valuable objects. It was the opportunity to continue work that mattered, to be part of preserving cultural heritage for future generations. As I drifted off to sleep in Helen's guest bedroom, I felt the weight of that responsibility settling over me like a blanket, protective and comforting rather than burdensome. The morning sun filtered through the Douglas firs surrounding Helen's cabin, casting dancing shadows across the workshop floor as I prepared to follow her instructions for accessing the vault. I'd read her letter 3 times over breakfast, memorizing the precise sequence of actions required to activate the hidden mechanism. Helen's directions were characteristically detailed, written with the same methodical precision she'd applied to everything else in her life. The stone fireplace dominated the workshop's north wall, its hearth constructed from river rock that Helen's first husband had gathered from the nearby Salmon River decades earlier. According to her letter, the mechanism was triggered by pressing a specific combination of stones in the correct sequence, starting with a particular piece of quartz embedded near the lower left corner of the hearth surround. I knelt beside the fireplace and began counting stones according to Helen's diagram, feeling for the slight variations in texture that would identify the trigger points. The third stone from the corner yielded slightly to pressure, and I heard a faint click from somewhere within the wall structure. Following Helen's instructions, I moved to a piece of basalt, positioned 18 inches higher and pressed firmly until it too clicked into place. The final trigger was a smooth river stone positioned at eye level on the right side of the hearth. When I pressed it, I heard the distinct sound of electric motors engaging somewhere behind the stone wall. The entire right section of the fireplace began rotating inward on hidden hinges, revealing a steel doorway set into the cabin's foundation. The engineering was remarkable, clearly the work of someone who'd invested considerable thought and resources into concealing the vault's existence. The steel door was secured with an electronic lock that required a 6-digit code. Helen's letter provided the combination, along with a note explaining that the numbers represented the dates of my graduation from the Gemological Institute of America. Even in her final instructions, she'd found a way to remind me that this inheritance was specifically meant for someone with my training and expertise. The vault beyond exceeded every expectation I'd formed from Helen's descriptions. The space was larger than many commercial jewelry stores, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the cabin's foundation. Professional display lighting illuminated climate-controlled cases that lined the walls, while a sophisticated air filtration system maintained optimal conditions for preserving delicate materials. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a museum-quality conservation facility that must have cost Helen hundreds of thousands of dollars to construct. The first display case I examined contained what appeared to be a complete collection of Russian imperial jewelry from the late 19th century. Elaborate pieces featuring cabochon sapphires and rose-cut diamonds were arranged on custom display stands, each item accompanied by detailed documentation cards written in Helen's careful handwriting. The centerpiece was a magnificent Kokoshnik-style tiara that seemed to capture and multiply every photon of light that touched its surface. I recognized the style immediately from my studies in historical jewelry design. These pieces matched the aesthetic of the Fabergé workshops during their golden period, when Russian imperial commissions represented the pinnacle of European jewelry craftsmanship. If authentic, the collection represented not just monetary value, but irreplaceable examples of artistic technique that had been lost when the imperial system collapsed. Moving to the next case, I discovered a stunning array of Art Deco pieces that showcased the geometric precision and bold color combinations that defined the movement. Platinum settings held precisely cut emeralds, rubies, and sapphires in angular patterns that embodied the machine-age optimism of the 1920s. Each piece was a masterwork of technical execution, representing the brief period when traditional handcraftsmanship merged with modernist design principles. But it was the third display case that truly took my breath away. Inside was a collection of ancient jewelry that appeared to span several millennia and multiple civilizations. Golden torques that might have adorned Celtic chieftains sat beside delicate Roman fibulae and elaborate Egyptian collar necklaces, featuring intricate cloisonné work. These weren't just valuable antiques. They were archaeological artifacts that belonged in major museums rather than private collections. Each piece was accompanied by detailed provenance documentation that revealed Helen's meticulous research methodology. She'd traced ownership histories through insurance records, estate inventories, and auction house catalogs, creating comprehensive genealogies for items that had often changed hands multiple times during periods of political upheaval. Her files included correspondence with scholars, museum curators, and legal experts who'd helped her navigate the complex ethical questions surrounding ownership of culturally significant artifacts. The scope of Helen's collection became more apparent as I continued exploring the vault. Specialized storage drawers contained hundreds of loose gemstones, each individually documented and graded according to the standards I'd learned at the Gemological Institute. These weren't random accumulations. They were carefully curated selections of exceptional stones that represented specific historical periods or geographic regions. One drawer held what appeared to be a comprehensive sampling of Kashmir sapphires from the legendary deposits discovered in the 1880s. The stones exhibited the distinctive cornflower blue color and velvety texture that made Kashmir sapphires the most prized blue gemstones in the world. Another drawer contained Burmese rubies with the deep red coloration that gemologists call pigeon's blood, including several stones that exceeded 5 carats without visible inclusions. The diamond collection was particularly impressive, featuring stones that represented every significant discovery location and cutting style from the past 2 centuries. I identified examples from the historic mines of Golconda in India, known for producing the world's most famous large diamonds, alongside more recent discoveries from African deposits. The cutting styles ranged from primitive early techniques to modern precision work that maximized brilliance and fire. But beyond their individual value, these gemstones told the story of global trade, colonial exploitation, and technological advancement over several centuries. Helen had assembled what amounted to a comprehensive library of geological and cultural history, preserved in crystalline form. Each stone carried information about the conditions under which it formed millions of years ago, the circumstances of its discovery, and the human stories of everyone who'd owned or worked with it since. As I continued examining the collection, I began to understand the true magnitude of what Helen had accomplished. This wasn't simply valuable jewelry acquisition. It was systematic cultural preservation on a scale that rivaled major institutional collections. Helen had identified items of historical significance that were at risk of being lost, dispersed, or destroyed. And she'd created a safe repository where they could be properly maintained until their ultimate destinations could be determined. The documentation accompanying each piece revealed Helen's deep understanding of the legal and ethical complexities surrounding ownership of cultural artifacts. Many items had been displaced during World War II, when Nazi art theft and the chaos of military occupation had scattered countless collections across Europe. Others had been removed from their countries of origin during colonial periods or political upheavals, creating ownership questions that persisted decades later. Helen had been working with legitimate institutions to resolve these questions whenever possible. Her correspondence files included letters from museums around the world, documenting her efforts to repatriate items to their proper cultural contexts. She'd successfully returned several pieces to families who'd lost them during the Holocaust, and she donated others to museums that could display them appropriately while ensuring their preservation for future generations. But some items remained in legal limbo, their ownership complicated by conflicting claims or inadequate documentation. Helen had been maintaining these pieces in trust, essentially serving as a temporary custodian, while waiting for circumstances that would allow proper resolution of their status. Her will named me as her successor in this role, along with specific instructions for handling various categories of items based on their legal and cultural situations. The responsibility was overwhelming. Helen had entrusted me with items worth tens of millions of dollars, along with the complex ethical obligations that accompanied their stewardship. Some pieces needed to be returned to specific families or institutions. Others required careful research to determine their proper destinations. Still others might eventually be appropriate for public sale or donation to museums that could ensure their preservation and accessibility. But Helen had also provided me with the resources necessary to fulfill these responsibilities. Her files included contact information for scholars, legal experts, and museum professionals who'd assisted her over the years. She'd established relationships with reputable institutions that could provide authentication services, conservation expertise, and guidance on repatriation procedures. Most importantly, she documented her own research methodology so thoroughly that I could continue her work with confidence. As I spent hours exploring the vault, I began to appreciate the sophisticated systems Helen had developed for managing such a complex collection. Each item was assigned a unique catalog number that corresponded to detailed records stored both digitally and in hard copy. Photographs documented the condition of every piece, while spectroscopic analysis had been performed on many of the gemstones to confirm their natural origin and geographic source. The security measures were equally impressive. The vault's location beneath the cabin's foundation made it virtually invisible to casual observation, while sophisticated alarm systems would alert both local law enforcement and a private security company if the space was compromised. Climate control systems maintained optimal temperature and humidity levels automatically, and backup power systems ensured continuous operation even during extended outages. Helen had even planned for the possibility that something might happen to her before she could complete her work. Sealed envelopes in a secure filing cabinet contained instructions for handling various contingencies, including contacts for legal assistance and guidance for liquidating portions of the collection if necessary to cover maintenance costs or legal expenses. The magnitude of Helen's foresight was humbling. She'd spent decades building not just a collection, but an entire infrastructure for responsible stewardship of cultural artifacts. She'd anticipated problems I wouldn't have thought to consider, and developed solutions that protected both the items themselves and anyone who might inherit responsibility for them. But as I continued exploring the vault, I also began to understand why Helen had been so secretive about her activities. The value of the collection made it a potential target for theft, while the complicated ownership history of many items could attract unwanted attention from various parties with competing claims. Helen had been protecting not just valuable objects but also herself and her family from the risks that accompanied possession of such items. This realization brought my thoughts back to my father and Amanda, who were undoubtedly spending their morning cataloging Helen's more conventional assets. They had no idea that the worthless cabin they'd mocked contained treasures that dwarfed everything else in Helen's estate combined. Part of me wondered how they'd react if they discovered the truth, but a larger part of me was grateful that Helen had structured her will to protect the collection from people who might not understand or appreciate its true significance. The locked filing cabinet in the workshop suddenly took on new importance. If Helen had been as thorough about documentation as everything else suggested, that cabinet likely contained the master records for the entire collection, along with her strategic plans for its eventual disposition. Finding the key to that cabinet would be essential for understanding how to proceed with Helen's vision. I spent the remaining daylight hours photographing key pieces in the vault and reviewing Helen's documentation systems. The scale of the collection was so vast that proper evaluation would require weeks or even months of careful examination. But even my preliminary assessment made it clear that Helen had assembled one of the most significant private collections of historical jewelry and gemstones on the West Coast. As evening approached, I secured the vault and returned to the main cabin, my mind reeling from the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The 5 diamonds from the safety deposit box, which had seemed so impressive just days earlier, now appeared almost modest in comparison to the treasures hidden beneath the cabin's foundation. Helen's inheritance wasn't just valuable, it was transformative, offering opportunities and responsibilities that would reshape my entire career. But with those opportunities came serious challenges. The collection's very existence created security risks that would require careful management. The legal complexities surrounding many items would demand expert consultation and possibly years of research to resolve properly. Most importantly, honoring Helen's vision would require the same level of dedication and discretion that she'd maintained throughout her decades of collecting. Sitting by the fire that evening, I tried to process the full implications of what Helen had entrusted to me. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a calling that would require me to become something more than a commercial gemologist. Helen had been operating as a cultural conservator, working to preserve items of historical significance while navigating complex ethical and legal challenges. She'd chosen me as her successor in this role, trusting that my training and character would enable me to continue her work appropriately. The weight of that trust was both inspiring and daunting. Helen had spent 20 years building something remarkable, and she'd placed its future entirely in my hands. The decisions I made over the coming weeks and months would determine not just my own future, but the fate of countless irreplaceable artifacts that deserved to be preserved and appreciated by future generations. As I prepared for another night in Helen's cabin, I felt the presence of her expectations settling around me like a comfortable but substantial cloak. Tomorrow, I would need to begin the careful work of understanding exactly what she'd assembled and developing plans for honoring her vision while ensuring the collection's continued security and proper stewardship. But tonight, I simply marveled at the magnitude of what Helen had accomplished in secret, and at the profound trust she'd placed in my ability to continue her extraordinary work. The cabin that my family had dismissed as worthless was actually the headquarters of one of the most significant cultural preservation efforts in the Pacific Northwest, and Helen had made me its sole guardian and heir. 3 weeks into my stay at Helen's cabin, I was methodically photographing and cataloging the ancient jewelry collection when my phone buzzed with a text message from Amanda. The signal was weak this far up the mountain, but the message came through clearly enough to make my blood run cold. Dad hired a property appraiser. Coming up Thursday to assess cabin value before you waste money on repairs. Hope you don't mind the company. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling slightly as the implications sank in. An appraiser would want access to every part of the property, including the workshop. Even if I managed to keep the vault sealed, any competent assessor would notice the sophisticated security systems, climate control equipment, and professional lighting that transformed what should have been a rustic mountain retreat into something resembling a high-end laboratory. More concerning was the timing. Thursday was only 2 days away, and I still hadn't located the key to Helen's locked filing cabinet. Without access to her master records, I couldn't fully understand the legal status of many pieces in the collection, nor could I implement her plans for their eventual disposition. An interruption now could compromise years of Helen's careful work. I called Amanda immediately, hoping to dissuade her from bringing an appraiser to the property during what was supposed to be my exclusive access period. The call went straight to voicemail, as did my subsequent attempt to reach my father. Their silence felt deliberately evasive, suggesting they'd already made their decision and weren't interested in negotiating. That evening, I intensified my search for the missing key, examining every possible hiding place in the cabin with systematic thoroughness. Helen had been methodical about everything else. Surely she wouldn't have left such a crucial component to chance. I checked inside books, under furniture, behind picture frames, and within the various containers scattered throughout the workshop. It was nearly midnight when I finally discovered the key, hidden inside a hollowed-out section of one of the stone logs that formed the cabin's interior walls. The hiding place was so ingenious that I never would have found it without literally running my hands along every surface in desperation. Helen had carved out a small cavity in the log and covered it with a carefully fitted piece of bark that blended seamlessly with the surrounding wood. The filing cabinet contained exactly what I'd hoped to find. Helen's master records documented every piece in the collection, with photographs, provenance research, legal assessments, and strategic recommendations for eventual placement. More importantly, the files revealed that Helen had been in contact with several major museums about significant donations, pending resolution of various ownership questions. One folder contained correspondence with the Metropolitan Museum of Art regarding the Russian imperial jewelry collection. The museum's curators had authenticated several pieces and expressed strong interest in acquiring the entire collection for permanent display. Helen had been negotiating the terms of the donation, with the understanding that proper attribution would honor both the original craftsman and her role in preserving the pieces during their period of displacement. Another folder documented Helen's work with the Holocaust Claims Processing Office to identify and return items that had been stolen from Jewish families during World War II. She'd successfully repatriated 17 pieces over the past decade, working with genealogists and historians to locate surviving family members or appropriate memorial institutions. Several more items were in various stages of the repatriation process, awaiting final documentation or family contact. The ancient jewelry collection was perhaps the most complex from a legal standpoint. Helen had been working with UNESCO and various national governments to determine appropriate destinations for pieces that represented important cultural heritage. Some items were slated for return to their countries of origin, while others had been cleared for donation to museums that could ensure proper scholarly access and public education. But the files also revealed that Helen had been receiving pressure from various parties who wanted to acquire pieces from her collection through less legitimate means. Insurance investigators had been asking questions about items that matched descriptions of pieces stolen from other collections. Private collectors had been making unsolicited offers that far exceeded market values, suggesting they knew more about the collection's contents than Helen had publicly revealed. Most troubling were references to individuals who'd been making inquiries about Helen's activities in the months before her death. The files included photocopies of threatening letters from people claiming ownership of various pieces, along with documentation of suspicious phone calls and unwanted visits to the jewelry shop downtown. Helen had been concerned enough about these contacts to increase security at both the cabin and the shop. Reading through these files, I began to understand why Helen had been so secretive about her collection and why she'd structured her will to protect it from family members who might not appreciate the delicate situation. The collection's value made it attractive to thieves, while its complicated legal status created vulnerability to fraudulent claims and legal challenges. Helen had been protecting not just valuable objects, but also herself and anyone who might inherit responsibility for the collection. By keeping the vault's existence secret and maintaining the cabin's appearance as a simple mountain retreat, she'd minimized the risks associated with housing such significant items in a relatively remote location. Armed with Helen's master records, I spent Wednesday developing a comprehensive security plan for Thursday's visit. I moved the most valuable loose stones from the vault to a temporary hiding place in the cabin's foundation, sealed the vault entrance, and rearranged the workshop to look like a hobbyist's craft room, rather than a professional conservation facility. The sophisticated equipment couldn't be hidden completely, but I found explanations that would satisfy a casual observer. The professional lighting became photography equipment for documenting estate pieces. The climate control system was necessary for preserving wooden furniture in the mountain environment. The security system protected Helen's modest collection of family heirlooms from break-ins during the winter months when the cabin sat empty. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical for late October in the Oregon mountains. I was sipping coffee and reviewing my cover story when I heard vehicles approaching on the gravel road. Through the window, I watched my father's Mercedes SUV pull up beside Helen's old Subaru, followed by a white pickup truck with mountain property assessments painted on the side. The appraiser turned out to be a competent-looking man in his 50s named Jim Morrison, who approached his work with professional thoroughness. He spent an hour examining the cabin's exterior, measuring the structure, and evaluating the condition of the roof, foundation, and mechanical systems. His questions were detailed and knowledgeable, suggesting he had considerable experience with mountain properties. My father and Amanda accompanied Morrison through the interior assessment, pointing out what they considered deficiencies that would reduce the property's value. The outdated kitchen appliances, the need for bathroom renovation, the cost of upgrading the electrical service to handle modern demands. They seemed determined to establish that the cabin was more liability than asset, but Morrison's evaluation was more balanced. He noted the quality of the original construction, the excellent maintenance Helen had provided over the decades, and the property's prime location within easy driving distance of Portland. When he examined the workshop, he showed particular interest in the climate control and security systems. "This is pretty sophisticated equipment for a mountain cabin," Morrison observed, examining the temperature and humidity monitoring displays. "Your grandmother must have had some valuable items she wanted to protect." "Just family heirlooms and her jewelry collection," I replied carefully. "Nothing too exotic, but she was particular about preservation." Morrison nodded and made notes on his tablet. He spent several minutes examining the stone fireplace, running his hands along the hearth surround in a way that made my heart race. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might accidentally trigger the mechanism that revealed the vault entrance. but he was simply evaluating the stonework craftsmanship and checking for signs of structural problems. The assessment concluded without incident, and Morrison promised to have his written report completed within a week. As he loaded his equipment into the pickup truck, I overheard him telling my father that the property was worth considerably more than they'd expected, thanks to Helen's maintenance and the professional-grade system she'd installed. After Morrison left, my father and Amanda lingered at the cabin, clearly hoping to convince me to consider selling the property rather than investing in restoration. Their arguments were logical from a purely financial perspective. The cabin required ongoing maintenance that would be expensive to provide from a distance. The property taxes were substantial for someone without significant income from other sources. The isolated location made it impractical as a primary residence for someone pursuing a career in urban markets. But their suggestions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what Helen had actually left me. They saw an aging mountain cabin that would consume resources without providing adequate returns. I saw the headquarters of a cultural preservation operation that represented decades of careful work and generated responsibilities that transcended simple financial calculations. I'm thinking about keeping it as a research facility, I told them, which was true enough without revealing the full scope of what that research entailed. Helen left me a lot of historical jewelry pieces that need proper documentation and evaluation. Amanda rolled her eyes. Jessica, you can't make a living playing with old jewelry in the mountains. You need to think practically about your future. But as they drove away that afternoon, I was already thinking about my future in ways they couldn't imagine. Helen's files had revealed opportunities that extended far beyond simple inheritance management. Major museums were interested in acquiring portions of the collection. Scholars wanted access to pieces that could provide new insights into historical craftsmanship techniques. Law enforcement agencies needed expert assistance with authentication and provenance research. Helen had been operating as an informal consultant to various institutions, providing expertise that had earned both professional respect and substantial fees. Her records showed payments from insurance companies, auction houses, and private collectors who'd relied on her authentication services. The cabin wasn't just a storage facility. It was the base of operations for a consulting practice that could support both the collection's maintenance and my own professional development. Over the following weeks, I began implementing Helen's plans for the collection's eventual disposition. The Metropolitan Museum confirmed their interest in the Russian imperial pieces, and we began negotiating a donation agreement that would provide appropriate recognition for Helen's preservation efforts. The Holocaust Claims Processing Office accepted my offer to continue Helen's repatriation work, with compensation that would help cover the collection's ongoing maintenance costs. Most importantly, I established relationships with the scholars and legal experts who'd been working with Helen. They welcomed my involvement and expressed confidence that I could continue her work effectively. Several museums expressed interest in employing me as a consulting curator, recognizing that access to Helen's collection would enhance their own research and exhibition capabilities. The locked filing cabinet had contained one final surprise. Hidden beneath the master records was a business plan that Helen had been developing for the past year, outlining her vision for transforming her informal consulting practice into a legitimate research institute. The plan included partnerships with major universities, funding strategies for ongoing operations, and a governance structure that would ensure the collection's continued accessibility to legitimate scholars while maintaining appropriate security. Helen had been planning to reveal this vision during what would have been my next visit to the cabin. Her death had interrupted that timeline, but the foundation she'd laid made it possible for me to continue her work with confidence. The business plan even included a proposed name for the institute, the Morgan Center for Jewelry and Cultural Heritage Studies. 6 months after that gray October morning when my father burned what he thought was my inheritance, I stood in the same conference room at Wells & Associates, signing papers that established the Morgan Center as a legitimate nonprofit organization. Patricia Wells, who'd become both legal advisor and friend during the transition process, handed me the final documents with a smile. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said. She spent years planning for this moment. The Morgan Center opened quietly the following spring, announcing itself to the academic community through scholarly publications rather than media attention. Our first major exhibition, featuring pieces from the Russian Imperial Collection, was hosted by the Portland Art Museum and attracted international attention from jewelry historians and cultural preservationists. My father and Amanda attended the opening reception, moving through the galleries with expressions of stunned bewilderment as they gradually understood what Helen had actually left me. The placard beside the centerpiece tiara credited, "The Helen Morgan Collection, preserved through the generosity of the Morgan Center for Jewelry and Cultural Heritage Studies." "I had no idea," my father murmured as we stood beside the display case containing the Art Deco pieces. When Helen talked about her jewelry collection, I thought she meant costume jewelry and family heirlooms. Amanda was examining the detailed provenance documentation that accompanied each piece. "These authentication certificates are from major auction houses," she said slowly. "Some of these pieces are worth more than our house." But by then, the collection's monetary value seemed almost secondary to its cultural significance. Working with Helen's pieces had connected me to a global community of scholars, conservators, and cultural institutions dedicated to preserving human artistic achievement. The Morgan Center had become a destination for researchers studying everything from ancient metalworking techniques to the impact of political upheaval on artistic production. The most rewarding aspect of the work was continuing Helen's repatriation efforts. Over the past year, we'd successfully returned 12 pieces to families or institutions that had lost them during various historical crises. Each repatriation involved months of research and negotiation, but the moments when we could reunite people with family heirlooms that had been missing for decades made every challenge worthwhile. Standing in that exhibition gallery, surrounded by pieces that represented centuries of human creativity and craftsmanship, I finally understood the full magnitude of Helen's gift. She hadn't just left me valuable objects. She'd given me a purpose that connected my professional skills to work that mattered beyond personal advancement. The cabin in the mountains remained the center's primary research facility, its vault now expanded to accommodate new acquisitions, and its workshop upgraded with even more sophisticated conservation equipment. But the center's influence extended far beyond the Oregon mountains, connecting us to preservation efforts around the world. Helen's business plan had anticipated this growth, outlining strategies for international collaboration and long-term sustainability. Her vision was becoming reality, transforming what had begun as one woman's private collection into an institution that served the global community of scholars and cultural preservationists. As I watched visitors examining the exhibition pieces with wonder and appreciation, I thought about that morning when my father had celebrated my inheritance of what he'd considered worthless mountain property. His champagne toast had been premature but not entirely wrong. Helen had indeed left me something that required careful stewardship and ongoing investment. She'd just given me something far more valuable and significant than he could have imagined. The call came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, jolting me awake in Helen's guest bedroom where I'd been staying for the past month. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was all too familiar. It was Marcus Webb, a private collector from Seattle, who'd been mentioned in several of Helen's warning files as someone who made persistent inquiries about acquiring specific pieces from her collection. "Miss Morgan, I understand you've inherited your grandmother's interesting little hobby," Webb said without preamble, his tone carrying the kind of casual arrogance that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I'd like to discuss a business proposition that could be mutually beneficial." I was instantly alert, remembering Helen's notes about Webb's increasingly aggressive attempts to purchase items she'd refused to sell. According to her records, he'd been particularly interested in the ancient jewelry collection, making offers that far exceeded legitimate market values and suggesting he had buyers lined up who weren't concerned about provenance documentation. "I'm not interested in selling any of Helen's collection," I replied carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral while my mind raced through the implications of his call. How had he learned about my inheritance so quickly, and more importantly, how much did he know about what Helen had actually left me? Webb's laugh was unpleasant. "Miss Morgan, I don't think you fully understand your situation. Your grandmother was holding some items that belonged to clients of mine, people who are quite eager to recover their property. We can handle this transaction quietly and professionally, or we can involve lawyers and make things more complicated for everyone." The threat was barely veiled, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain morning air. Helen's files had documented similar pressure tactics Webb had used with other collectors, gradually escalating from polite inquiries to legal threats, to more direct forms of intimidation. She'd been concerned enough about his interest to install additional security measures at the cabin during her final year. Any legitimate ownership claims can be handled through proper legal channels, I said, ending the call before Webb could respond. But as I sat in the pre-dawn darkness, I realized that Helen's death had made me a target for people who'd been frustrated by her refusal to cooperate with their questionable business practices. Over the following days, I received similar contacts from other individuals who'd apparently been waiting for an opportunity to pressure Helen's heir into transactions she'd refused to authorize. A woman claiming to represent Swiss banking interests wanted to discuss repatriation of items she said had been improperly removed from safety deposit boxes during World War II. A man with a pronounced Eastern European accent offered to pay cash for any pieces that might have originated in countries that were now seeking to recover cultural artifacts. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Initial politeness that quickly shifted to implied threats when I declined to negotiate. References to legal complications I might face if I didn't cooperate voluntarily. Suggestions that Helen's collecting activities hadn't been entirely legitimate, and that I could face criminal liability if I continued her practices. The pressure campaign was clearly coordinated, designed to overwhelm me with multiple demands while I was still grieving Helen's loss and trying to understand the scope of what she'd left me. These people had been watching Helen's activities for years, waiting for exactly this moment when her protection would be transferred to someone they perceived as inexperienced and vulnerable. But Helen had anticipated this possibility and prepared me for it. Her files included detailed documentation of each individual's questionable practices, along with evidence that their claims were either fraudulent or legally invalid. More importantly, she'd established relationships with law enforcement agencies and legal experts who specialized in art theft and cultural property disputes. I spent that weekend reviewing Helen's security protocols and implementing additional measures she'd recommended for high-risk situations. The cabin's alarm system was upgraded to provide immediate notification to both local law enforcement and a private security company that specialized in protecting high-value collections. Motion sensors were installed throughout the property, creating multiple layers of detection that would alert me to any unauthorized approach. Most importantly, I contacted David Chen, the intellectual property attorney Helen had worked with on several repatriation cases. Chen had 20 years of experience dealing with fraudulent ownership claims and the various criminal organizations that operated in the gray areas of international art markets. When I described the recent contacts I'd received, he wasn't surprised. "Your grandmother had been expecting this," Chen explained during our meeting at his downtown Portland office. She'd been documenting threats and suspicious inquiries for the past 2 years, building a case file that would protect both her collection and whoever inherited responsibility for it. Chen showed me additional evidence Helen had compiled, including recorded phone conversations, documented attempts at surveillance, and financial records that revealed connections between several of the people who'd contacted me. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort by individuals who specialized in acquiring disputed cultural artifacts through intimidation and legal manipulation. "The good news is that Helen was extremely careful about documentation," Chen continued. "Every piece in her collection has been properly researched and legally acquired. The people pressuring you know they don't have legitimate claims, which is why they're relying on intimidation, instead of filing proper legal challenges." But Chen also warned me that the harassment would likely escalate as these individuals realized I wasn't going to be intimidated into quick sales. They'd invested considerable time and resources into monitoring Helen's activities, and my inheritance represented their best opportunity to acquire items they'd been unable to obtain through legitimate means. The escalation began the following week. I returned to the cabin after a day in Portland to find that someone had been on the property during my absence. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but subtle signs suggested a professional search had been conducted. Drawers that I always left precisely aligned were slightly askew. Books on shelves were in slightly different positions. Most telling, the dust patterns on surfaces had been disrupted in ways that indicated systematic examination. The intrusion hadn't triggered the alarm system, suggesting whoever had conducted the search possessed sophisticated technical skills. They'd been careful not to cause obvious damage or theft that would have prompted immediate police involvement. Instead, they'd gathered intelligence about the property's layout and security measures while sending a clear message that my privacy could be violated whenever they chose. I called Chen immediately and spent the next day upgrading the cabin's security to military-grade standards. Professional installers worked through the weekend to install motion detectors that couldn't be easily circumvented, cameras that provided comprehensive coverage of all approaches to the property, and communication systems that would maintain contact with security services, even if landlines or cellular networks were compromised. But the most important security measure was transferring the most valuable items from the cabin's vault to secure storage facilities in Portland. Working with a specialized art transportation company, I moved the Russian Imperial Collection, the most significant ancient pieces, and the highest value loose stones to climate-controlled vaults at facilities that provided round-the-clock professional security. The transfer process took 3 days and required coordination with insurance companies, security services, and the various museums and institutions that would eventually receive many of the pieces. Each item was photographed, documented, and assigned to specific destination categories based on Helen's master plan for the collection's eventual disposition. During this process, I made a discovery that transformed my understanding of what Helen had actually accomplished. Hidden in a sealed compartment within the vault was a collection of documents that revealed her role in one of the most significant art recovery operations of the past decade. Helen had been working undercover with FBI agents specializing in art theft, helping them track stolen items and identify the networks that moved cultural artifacts through international black markets. Her collecting activities had provided cover for investigating dealers who specialized in items with questionable provenance, while her expertise had been crucial for authenticating recovered pieces and connecting them to their original owners. The documents revealed that Helen's death had interrupted an ongoing investigation into a smuggling network that moved ancient artifacts from conflict zones to private collectors in the United States and Europe. The people who'd been pressuring me weren't just opportunistic dealers. They were part of the criminal organization Helen had been helping law enforcement investigate. My inheritance hadn't just made me the owner of a valuable collection. It had made me a crucial witness in a federal investigation that could expose decades of cultural property theft. The pressure campaign I'd been experiencing was actually an attempt to prevent law enforcement from gaining access to evidence Helen had compiled over years of undercover work. Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's art crime team contacted me the following week, confirming what I'd discovered in Helen's hidden files. Helen had been working with federal agents for the past 5 years, documenting the activities of dealers who specialized in stolen cultural artifacts, while using her legitimate collecting and repatriation work as cover for the investigation. Your grandmother was one of our most valuable civilian consultants, Martinez explained during our first meeting. Her expertise and access to dealer networks provided intelligence we couldn't have obtained through traditional investigative methods. The evidence Helen had compiled was extensive enough to support prosecutions of multiple individuals involved in international art theft. But her death had left several active investigations without their primary source of expertise and intelligence. The people pressuring me were attempting to prevent federal agents from accessing this evidence while also acquiring items that could connect them to various criminal activities. Martinez explained that my cooperation with the ongoing investigation would provide legal protection against the various fraudulent claims being made against Helen's collection. Federal prosecutors were prepared to support my ownership rights in exchange for continued access to Helen's files and assistance with authentication and provenance research for recovered stolen items. The partnership also offered opportunities that aligned perfectly with Helen's vision for the collection's future. The FBI needed expert consultants who could authenticate recovered artifacts and research their proper ownership, while various cultural institutions needed access to Helen's documentation methods and provenance research techniques. Over the following months, I found myself working as a consulting expert for federal investigations, while simultaneously implementing Helen's plans for donating portions of the collection to appropriate museums and institutions. The work was challenging and occasionally dangerous, but it provided exactly the kind of meaningful purpose Helen had intended when she chose me as her heir. The pressure from Webb and his associates continued for several weeks, but federal protection and the knowledge that their activities were under active investigation gradually reduced their willingness to escalate their tactics. Several individuals were arrested on charges related to art theft and fraud, while others simply disappeared from the legitimate art market, apparently deciding that continued harassment wasn't worth the legal risks they faced. The most satisfying moment came 6 months after Helen's death, when I was able to attend the arrest of Marcus Webb at his Seattle gallery. Federal agents had used evidence from Helen's files to obtain warrants for searching his premises, where they discovered dozens of stolen artifacts that had been reported missing from museums and private collections around the world. Webb's arrest made headlines in art world publications, exposing a smuggling network that had been operating for decades while masquerading as legitimate international dealers. The investigation ultimately led to prosecutions in multiple countries and the recovery of cultural artifacts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But beyond the criminal justice aspects, Helen's legacy continued through the legitimate work of preserving and properly placing her collection. The Morgan Center for Jewelry and Cultural Heritage Studies opened its doors 18 months after Helen's death, occupying a renovated warehouse in Portland's Pearl District that provided both public exhibition space and professional research facilities. The center's first major exhibition featured pieces from Helen's collection, alongside items recovered through federal investigations, telling the story of cultural preservation efforts and the ongoing fight against art theft. Museum curators, law enforcement officials, and scholars from around the world attended the opening, recognizing the center as a unique institution that combined academic research with practical support for cultural property protection. My father and Amanda attended the opening reception, moving through the galleries with expressions that shifted from confusion to amazement as they gradually understood the scope of what Helen had actually accomplished. The exhibition materials explained Helen's role in federal investigations and the center's mission to continue her work in cultural preservation and law enforcement support. "I never imagined Helen was involved in anything like this," my father said as we stood beside a display case containing artifacts that had been recovered from international smuggling operations. When she talked about her jewelry collection, I thought she meant the costume jewelry she sold at the shop. Amanda was reading a placard that described Helen's undercover work with federal agents. "She was basically a spy," she said slowly. "All those years we thought she was just playing with old jewelry. She was actually working with the FBI to catch art thieves." The center's work expanded rapidly as word spread through academic and law enforcement communities about our unique combination of expertise and resources. We began receiving requests from museums, universities, and government agencies around the world for assistance with authentication, provenance research, and cultural property protection. Each project connected us to new aspects of the global effort to preserve cultural heritage and combat art theft. We helped identify stolen artifacts being offered at major auction houses, assisted in returning family heirlooms to Holocaust survivors, and provided expertise for investigations into smuggling networks operating in conflict zones. The work was exactly what Helen had envisioned when she chose me as her successor. She'd seen in me not just technical expertise in gemology, but the character traits necessary for handling the complex ethical and legal challenges that accompanied work in cultural preservation. She'd trusted me to continue her mission of protecting beautiful and historically significant objects, while ensuring they found their way to appropriate destinations where they could be properly preserved and appreciated. Standing in the center's research facility 2 years after Helen's death, surrounded by artifacts that represented centuries of human creativity and craftsmanship, I finally understood the full magnitude of her gift. She hadn't just left me valuable objects. She'd given me a calling that connected my professional skills to work that mattered on a global scale. The cabin in the mountains remained an important part of the center's operations, serving as a secure research facility where scholars could examine items in controlled conditions while we determined their proper destinations. But the center's influence extended far beyond the Oregon mountains, connecting us to preservation efforts and criminal investigations around the world. Helen's vision had become reality, transforming what had begun as one woman's private collection into an institution that served the global community of scholars, law enforcement professionals, and cultural preservationists. Her legacy lived on through every artifact we helped return to its rightful owner, every smuggling network we helped expose, and every young scholar we trained in the methods she'd developed for researching and protecting cultural heritage. The morning my father had celebrated my inheritance of what he'd considered worthless mountain property, he'd been both wrong and right. Helen had indeed left me something that required careful stewardship, ongoing investment, and considerable personal sacrifice to maintain properly. She'd just given me something far more valuable and meaningful than he could have possibly imagined. The empty inheritance my family had mocked had become a full life dedicated to preserving humanity's cultural legacy for future generations. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. on a frigid January morning, piercing through the silence of my Portland apartment with an urgency that immediately snapped me awake. The caller was Dr. Elena Vasquez, Director of Antiquities at the Smithsonian Institution, and her voice carried an excitement that made sleep impossible to reconsider. "Jessica, we've had a breakthrough on the Mesopotamian cylinder seals from your grandmother's collection," she said without preamble. "The cuneiform translations are complete, and what we've discovered is going to rewrite entire chapters of ancient history textbooks." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. The cylinder seals had been among the most mysterious items in Helen's vault. Small stone cylinders carved with intricate scenes and cuneiform inscriptions that dated back over 4,000 years. Helen's documentation had traced them through a complex chain of ownership that included British archaeological expeditions, German museum collections, and wartime displacement during World War II. The inscriptions describe trade relationships between Mesopotamian city-states that we never knew existed, Dr. Vasquez continued. But more importantly, they reference a royal library that was thought to be completely lost. These seals might be the only surviving record of an entire civilization's administrative and commercial systems. The significance was staggering. Helen had somehow acquired artifacts that represented primary source material for understanding one of humanity's earliest urban civilizations. The seals weren't just valuable antiques. They were irreplaceable keys to unlocking mysteries that scholars had been trying to solve for over a century. This discovery exemplified everything the Morgan Center had accomplished during its first 3 years of operation. What had begun as Helen's private collection had evolved into a globally recognized institution that regularly produced groundbreaking research while supporting cultural preservation efforts around the world. The center's reputation had grown far beyond what I'd originally envisioned when I first discovered Helen's vault beneath the mountain cabin. We now employed a staff of 12 full-time researchers, maintained partnerships with over 40 universities and museums worldwide, and operated research facilities in 3 different locations across the Pacific Northwest. Our work had expanded into areas Helen probably never imagined when she first began collecting displaced cultural artifacts. We'd helped establish authentication protocols that were now used by major auction houses to verify the legitimacy of high-value items. Our database of stolen art and cultural artifacts had become a primary resource for law enforcement agencies investigating international art theft. Most importantly, we'd successfully repatriated over 300 items to their rightful owners or appropriate cultural institutions. The success brought responsibilities I hadn't anticipated when I inherited Helen's collection. Government agencies regularly consulted with us on policy matters related to cultural property protection. International organizations sought our expertise for developing standards and procedures for handling disputed artifacts. Academic institutions wanted access to our research methods and documentation systems. But perhaps most significantly, the center had become a destination for young scholars who shared Helen's passion for cultural preservation. Our fellowship program brought graduate students and early career researchers from around the world to Portland, where they worked alongside our permanent staff while developing expertise in authentication, provenance research, and ethical collection management. These fellows represented the future of cultural preservation, carrying the methods and values Helen had developed into new contexts and challenges. Watching them examine artifacts with the same careful attention to detail that Helen had taught me, I understood that her legacy would continue long after the specific items in her collection had been properly placed in permanent institutions. The center's influence extended into areas of policy and public education that complemented our research activities. We'd successfully advocated for stronger legal protections for cultural property, working with legislators to close loopholes that allowed stolen artifacts to be laundered through legitimate markets. Our public exhibitions had attracted over 500,000 visitors, creating awareness about cultural preservation issues, while showcasing the beauty and historical significance of properly maintained artifacts. The financial sustainability of these expanded operations had required careful planning and considerable fundraising effort. Helen's collection provided the foundation, but maintaining world-class research facilities and supporting a growing staff required ongoing revenue from consulting services, grants, and donations from individuals and institutions who supported our mission. The consulting work proved particularly rewarding, both financially and professionally. Major museums regularly requested our assistance with complex authentication projects that required the specialized knowledge and documentation methods Helen had developed. Insurance companies relied on our expertise for evaluating claims involving high-value cultural artifacts. Government agencies sought our support for investigating suspected art theft and cultural property violations. Each consulting project connected us to new aspects of the global art world, while generating revenue that supported our core mission of research and repatriation. We'd authenticated pieces for collections as diverse as European royal families and American technology entrepreneurs, always maintaining the ethical standards Helen had established for determining proper ownership and appropriate placement. The most complex project involved working with the German government to identify and return artifacts that had been looted during World War II, and subsequently dispersed through various channels into private collections. The work required years of archival research, diplomatic negotiations, and careful coordination with multiple international agencies. Our role in this project began when German researchers identified several items in Helen's documentation that matched descriptions of pieces stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust. Helen had already been working on repatriation efforts for some of these items, but her death had interrupted the process at a crucial stage, when final ownership questions were being resolved. Working with German officials, Holocaust survivor organizations, and various museums, we successfully returned 47 items to their rightful owners or appropriate memorial institutions. Each repatriation involved months of research and negotiation, but the moments when we could reunite families with heirlooms they'd thought were lost forever made every challenge worthwhile. The repatriation work attracted international attention and led to invitations to participate in similar projects in other countries. We helped establish protocols for handling cultural property disputes in post-conflict zones, advised governments on developing legal frameworks for protecting cultural heritage, and trained law enforcement officials in techniques for identifying and investigating art theft. These policy activities represented a natural evolution of Helen's work, extending her individual efforts to protect cultural artifacts into systematic changes that could benefit preservation efforts worldwide. The center had become not just a repository for her collection, but an active force for improving how societies handle questions of cultural property and heritage protection. The impact of our work was perhaps most visible in the academic collaborations that had developed around Helen's collection. University researchers from disciplines ranging from archaeology to materials science regularly visited our facilities to examine artifacts using techniques that hadn't been available when many pieces were originally studied. Advanced imaging technologies revealed previously unknown details about ancient manufacturing techniques. Chemical analysis provided new insights into trade relationships between different civilizations. Digital documentation methods created permanent records that could be shared with researchers worldwide without exposing fragile artifacts to unnecessary handling. These collaborative projects generated scholarly publications that enhanced understanding of human cultural development, while establishing the center's reputation as a leading institution for multidisciplinary research. Helen's collection had become the foundation for advancing knowledge across multiple fields of study, fulfilling her vision of making beautiful and historically significant objects accessible to legitimate scholars. The personal satisfaction of this work went far beyond professional achievement or financial success. Every day brought opportunities to connect with the human stories behind the artifacts in our care. Ancient jewelry told stories of love, loss, celebration, and remembrance that transcended the centuries between their creation and their current preservation. Historical pieces carried memories of the families who'd owned them, the craftsmen who'd created them, and the cultures they represented. Working with these objects required a combination of technical expertise and emotional sensitivity that Helen had embodied throughout her collecting career. Each piece demanded careful research, respectful handling, and thoughtful consideration of how best to honor both its historical significance and the wishes of people who'd owned it throughout its long journey to our care. The center's success had also transformed my relationship with my father and Amanda, who gradually came to understand not just the monetary value of what Helen had left me, but the profound significance of the work she'd entrusted to my care. They began attending our public exhibitions and educational programs, watching with evident pride as visitors from around the world examined artifacts that had once been dismissed as worthless mountain cabin contents. My father's accounting background proved unexpectedly valuable as the center's operations became more complex. He began volunteering his time to help with financial planning and compliance issues, bringing the same methodical attention to detail that had made him successful in business to the challenge of managing a nonprofit organization with international responsibilities. Amanda's real estate expertise became useful when we needed to expand our facilities to accommodate growing collections and research activities. She helped negotiate lease agreements, evaluate potential locations, and coordinate renovation projects that created specialized spaces for conservation work, scholarly research, and public exhibitions. Their involvement represented a form of reconciliation that went beyond simple family harmony. They'd begun to understand that Helen's decision to leave me the collection wasn't favoritism or eccentricity, but recognition of specific qualities and training that made me uniquely qualified to continue her work. More importantly, they'd come to appreciate that the work itself was valuable in ways that transcended financial considerations. The center's growth had also created opportunities for other family members to participate in meaningful ways. My cousin Michael, who'd studied art history before pursuing a career in technology, joined our staff as digital archives manager, developing systems for documenting and sharing our research with international collaborators. His technical skills, combined with his appreciation for historical materials, made him perfectly suited for bridging the gap between traditional scholarship and modern information management. These family connections added richness to the work that I don't think Helen could have anticipated when she planned her bequest. The center had become not just a continuation of her individual efforts, but a family enterprise that honored her values while bringing together diverse skills and perspectives in service of cultural preservation. The international recognition of our work culminated when UNESCO invited the center to participate in developing new protocols for protecting cultural heritage in conflict zones. The invitation acknowledged our expertise in handling disputed artifacts, while recognizing our success in developing ethical approaches to complex ownership questions. Working with UNESCO representatives from dozens of countries, we helped draft guidelines that balanced respect for cultural sovereignty with practical needs for protecting artifacts that might otherwise be lost during political upheavals. The protocols we developed were subsequently adopted by multiple international organizations and incorporated into legal frameworks for handling cultural property disputes. This policy work represented the ultimate fulfillment of Helen's vision for using expertise in cultural preservation to benefit society broadly. Her individual collecting efforts had evolved into institutional capabilities that could influence how entire societies approached questions of cultural heritage and preservation responsibility. Standing in the center's main exhibition hall 5 years after Helen's death, surrounded by artifacts that represented millennia of human creativity and cultural development, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. The vault hidden beneath Helen's mountain cabin had contained not just valuable objects, but the seeds of an institution that was now recognized worldwide for its contributions to cultural preservation and scholarship. The visitors moving through our galleries included schoolchildren discovering the beauty of ancient craftsmanship, graduate students conducting research that would advance their academic careers, and international dignitaries seeking to understand our approaches to cultural property protection. Each group brought different perspectives and interests, but all shared an appreciation for the careful work required to preserve humanity's cultural legacy. Helen had understood something profound about the relationship between individual responsibility and collective heritage. Her decision to rescue displaced artifacts and maintain them in trust until their proper destinations could be determined had created ripple effects that continued to expand years after her death. Every item we successfully repatriated, every scholar we trained, every policy we helped develop, represented an extension of her original vision. The empty inheritance my family had celebrated receiving nothing from had become a full life dedicated to work that mattered on a global scale. Helen's gift hadn't been valuable objects, but the opportunity to participate in preserving human cultural achievement for future generations. She'd recognized in me the qualities necessary for carrying forward this mission, and she'd trusted me with responsibilities that would define the rest of my career. The center's success had attracted attention from individuals and institutions seeking to donate their own collections for proper stewardship and research access. We'd become a destination for collectors who wanted to ensure their acquisitions would be properly maintained and ethically managed after their deaths. Each new collection brought unique challenges and opportunities, while expanding our capabilities for serving the global cultural preservation community. The growth continued to present new challenges and opportunities that required careful balance between our research mission and practical considerations of sustainability and security. But every challenge also represented another opportunity to apply Helen's methods and values to new contexts, extending her legacy into areas she probably never imagined when she first began collecting displaced cultural artifacts in her mountain cabin. As evening light filtered through the exhibition hall's windows, casting gentle illumination across display cases that held treasures from civilizations spanning thousands of years, I understood that Helen's greatest gift hadn't been the artifacts themselves, but the example she'd provided of how individual commitment to cultural preservation could create lasting positive change in the world. The Morgan Center for Jewelry and Cultural Heritage Studies would continue growing and evolving, but its foundation would always be the values Helen had embodied throughout her collecting career: respect for cultural heritage, commitment to ethical stewardship, dedication to scholarly excellence, and recognition that beautiful things deserve to be preserved and appreciated by future generations. Her legacy lived on through every artifact we protected, every scholar we trained, every family we helped reunite with their heritage, and every policy we influenced to better protect cultural property worldwide. The empty inheritance had become a full contribution to humanity's ongoing effort to understand and preserve its own cultural achievements. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.